on the air, sugar. You guys remember Flip Wilson? Or is that going way too back for you?
I remember Flip Wilson.
I'm under 60, so I don't. I'm sorry.
So, my goodness. Geez, I guess I am the oldest, crustiest one here. But welcome back. You are not watching an old stand-up routine because that's just not in our wheelhouse at all. Welcome back, HotHardware's 2.5 Geeks. Good to be back. Good to see everybody again on the interwebs here. I'm Dave Altavilla for HotHardware, and with me, the boys, the gents. The boys are back in town. Marco Chiappetta, Paul Lilly, and Chris is navigating the control room behind us. Can you say hi, Chris?
I can. Hello, hello.
The man behind the curtain.
The man behind the curtain. So we're sort of like 3 geeks or 2.5 geeks plus a spare geek. I don't know, whatever you want to call us today. That's what we're going to be. What's going on in your world these days, Paulie? Uncle Paulie?
I am just trying to keep cool, man. Just trying to keep cool.
Yeah. No, it's crazy hot up here in Boston. It's like stupid, humid and not nice and not fit for man to beast outside. So we'll stay inside and talk about technology. Marco, what's it like in Connecticut for you? Same?
Yeah, hot and sticky. I got the fan blasting on me right now. Hopefully it's not causing a bunch of turbulence on my mic.
Turbulence. We will skip the turbulence and have fun with it here. A little bit of tech talk. We have been off for a while. We've been running around, lots of different launches going on these days. Can't keep up with all the technology that's coming down the pipe, actually. And that's, for sure. We are literally working like dogs. But Marco, you've been spending some time with some big iron stuff these days in the data center, specifically some stuff from Intel, the Xeon Scalable architecture, and the latest Xeons based on the whatever generation processor Xeon we're on now. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you know there?
Yeah, it's been nuts. This is funny. This podcast, I'm going to be talking about the most powerful piece of hardware I've ever tested and probably the least powerful piece of hardware I've ever had written an article on. But yeah, so I had the opportunity to experiment with some crazy powerful systems. So Intel officially launched, they announced it, a few weeks back, but they officially launched their Intel Scalable Series Xeon processors. These are the platinum, gold, bronze, silver series Xeon processors based on Skylake SP. So the Skylake SP core is essentially the enterprise version of Skylake X, which was in the Core X series. But with these Xeon Scalable processors, you could get many, many more cores. Just to give you an example, the top-end SKU in the Xeon Scalable family can have 28 physical cores and support for 56 threads. So 10 more cores than even the Core i9 that's coming, in a few months. So massive, massive processors. They have, the cache has been restructured like the Core X series as well, up to 38.5 megs of a non-inclusive LLC cache. There's 3 UPI links that could link these processors in a multi-processor setup. They support 6-channel memory, so it's not dual or quad channel memory setup. So 6-channel memory setup for tons of bandwidth. They also support faster memory than the previous gen, so up to DDR4 2666. And their power envelopes, there's a huge range of processors in this lineup. They range from 70 watts all the way up to 205 watts. Now, what's really crazy, if you come over to HotHardware and you check the site, or even if you're a YouTuber and you want to just go through our channel after this, I had the chance to play with a 2P, so dual socket Xeon Scalable 81. Let me get the model number right. 8176 Platinum Series processors. So this is one notch down from the highest end SKU. Still 28 cores, 56 threads each processor. So this server can do 112 threads simultaneously. It's just 100 megahertz slower than the fastest SKU. And I had the chance to run a bunch of benchmarks on it, which we have posted. But in a video, I have video of a Xeon Platinum 8180 2P system running Cinebench. And if you really want to laugh and you want to see what a ton of threads can do on a system, you need to go watch this video. Actually, first run it on your system, especially if you have like a quad core. Then go watch this video and be prepared to freak out. In a 30-second video clip, there's 2 full runs of Cinebench in there. It's kind of insane.
Wow. Inside of 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Huh. My goodness. Well, if you've seen Cinebench, it's pretty heavy duty workload. It pegs all cores 100% and really taxes the system. It's sort of a bellwether benchmark that we use here on a regular basis, just a quick sanity check. The performance of a system, or specifically a processor, more so. But it seems like we're throwing a lot of cores at it. What are the thermals like with this thing? 28 cores. Would you say 200 and how many watts? 250 watts, something like that?
Up to 205 watts. So I actually don't have software that was reading the thermals properly. But what you have to understand is this was in a 2P server with fans that sound like a jet taking off. So thermals are a non-issue. There's big honking heat sinks. If you come by the site also, you can see pictures of what's inside the server. Big, huge, copper-based heat sinks and mass. I'm talking a ton of airflow. I had the thing set up on my desk here, and when I at one point I had to put in a GPU because Blender required OpenCL drivers, so I had to put in a GPU in the system, and I left the top of the chassis off, of the 2P chassis off, and it literally blew everything off of my desk immediately. It was like a friggin' hurricane in here. It's nuts. So thermals are a non-issue. These aren't. So this system that I tested, those processors are not destined for the workstation space. So, there's just massive cooling going on in those big iron servers. Now, in the lineup, there are SKUs that are designed for workstations. Those are typically the bronze or the silver SKUs. Mm-hmm. There's I didn't count the actual number, but there's something like, I don't know, 40 or 50 SKUs in the lineup. Way too many to go through here. If you jump to the last page of the article, there's a breakdown of all the different SKUs. But these are essentially the same core. It's Skylake X. So thermal should be in line. If you were to build a workstation, if you wanted a many-core workstation, because you're crunching lots of video, thermal should be in line, on a core for core, clock for clock basis. Whoops.
Yeah. Well, if you're talking 28 cores, it is sort of a compensation kind of thing, maybe for some folks, But let's talk about efficiency. That's kind of what I was getting at with thermals. If you look at the specs side by side, and the Xeon E5 versus Xeon Scalable, the previous generation, you've got a 55 to 145 watt envelope and a 70 to 205 watt envelope on the Scalable family. So obviously TDP is up a notch, but you're going from max 44 threads a socket to max 56 threads a socket. Is efficiency, what's the performance per watt like, in terms of the measurements there? Because obviously that's what the data center is looking for, is performance per watt, performance per square millimeter footprint, all that good stuff.
Yep. So it's actually it's more efficient. So you have a higher peak power consumption. I didn't have a complete top of the line previous gen system on hand. I did have a dual 2P E5 2697 V4 system on hand, however. So that system has 36 physical cores, support for 72 threads. Now, versus 56 physical cores and 112 threads in the newer Xeon Scalable server. Mm-hmm. The Xeon Scalable server only pulled about 75 more watts under full load with every core, every thread taxed. Okay. So it will pull more peak power, but the time to finish a workload will be shorter.
Yeah.
And if I loaded just the physical core, so not every thread, so 36 threads on the E5 and 56 threads on the Xeon Platinum, it was right in line. It was only 17 more watts. So this is all going to kind of vary depending on how much cache is being utilized in the particular workload. But you're looking at technically even if it does consume more peak power, a more efficient platform because of the improvements to the architecture, the ability to complete multi-threaded workloads faster with all those extra cores and threads. So it's a strong product lineup from Intel.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. What do you think? Versus we can switch gears to the other side of the fence, AMD EPYC and their EPYC 7000 series CPU. We had a launch unveiling with them as well, right around the same time frame. AMD is obviously back on the desktop with Ryzen. They are at least on paper from what we've seen, and we need to get our hands on on silicon. But if you look at it on paper, they're also back on the data center, matching up with better core counts per socket. More resources in the architecture. What are your thoughts with respect to EPYC versus Xeon Scalable?
Yeah, we need to test it before we say anything definitive. There are some numbers floating out there. Now, what I think you'll see, AMD has a couple of advantages, right? So you can get 32 physical cores in a single socket with an EPYC processor. So they will have more cores, more threads in a 2-piece setup. They also have more processor from die to die.
Message. Oh, there he is. You're back. You're back. I don't know if you're stream. Oh, the stream's back. All right. Well, let's keep rolling. Let's keep rolling then. Sorry about that. Chris, did you have an internet debacle going on there?
I don't know what just happened. I don't know if I should name names, but this is like the second time in the last week this has happened.
Hopefully we'll stay up and going, but let's keep journeying on here. And
let me just quickly summarize what we were saying when it dropped.
That's a good idea.
EPYC will probably be strong when just the CPU cores are utilized, factor in latency, and Intel may have an advantage. We will see, but EPYC is going to be a nice platform from AMD. And back to you, Dave.
How's that for a summary? No, I think it's actually it's going to be exciting to see what AMD can do with EPYC. I think if you look at the core resources on paper, the memory bandwidth on paper, the I/O connectivity, again, all the specs that sort of culminate to an entire platform.
How's the pricing compare between EPYC and Xeon? Is AMD kind of aggressive going after Intel?
Yes.
So we did get that.
It's funny. Didn't have direct pricing from Intel, right? So I didn't quote anything from Intel. If you have connections in the channel, you can find out. So the top of the line 28 core processors are in the greater than $8,000 each range, whereas the top end EPYC 7000 series processors are in the $4,000 range. So very aggressive pricing from AMD. Now, where it gets interesting, like these crazy high-end 2P platforms, they obviously don't sell as much as the more mainstream offerings, and you'd have to put together a 2P setup with two lower core count Xeons to match a 1P setup with 32 cores from AMD. So there's lots of interesting market dynamics going on there. Like AMD, assuming everything works well and it's embraced by the enterprise, they could have a really strong mainstream lineup there for 1P servers.
Yeah, and they'll be the first to point out that that's a big chunk of the market. Is 1P servers, and again, I think it's the other thing that's big in the data center is I/O connectivity, being able to plug in more GPUs, having more dedicated PCI Express lanes. That's a big advantage too. So, yeah, it's all going to come down to application performance.
You know what? I got to mention one more thing. Since you bring up connecting drives, Intel does have the new the volume manager built into these new processors. So it's sort of like it's what enables VROC on the desktop platform. So you can have these crazy huge direct attached to CPU NVMe RAID volumes on these Intel servers as well. So there's potential for some crazy fast storage setups on the Intel platform, even though technically AMD may have more PCI Express lanes and I/O connectivity. That feature on Intel could result in some, advantages in terms of latency and ultimately bandwidth for those crazy arrays set up in VMD.
Yeah, for storage. Yeah, no, that's the thing. It's going to be, case by case, application by application. See how things map out. So it'll be interesting to watch. At least what's encouraging is that at least AMD is in the game again. Right? I mean, they're back on the map, and that's huge. That's good for everybody. It's great for the data center. It's great for consumers on the desktop with Ryzen and versus Skylake X. So good stuff. Threadripper coming, right? One of these days.
Soon enough.
Yeah, can't talk too much about that, but let's move on. Let's move on to the mobile side of the house. and talk about a couple of machines that we've had the pleasure of spending some quality time with in notebooks, specifically the folks at NVIDIA. And I wanted to get actually Paul and Marco and Chris, maybe you can even chime in your thoughts on the technology, because it was better than expected for me. I took a look at the Asus ROG Zephyrus GX501 gaming notebook, along with our buddy Tuan, who helped write and work up this article with me. I did a little video work with it as well. And it is based on some new technology, certainly on the Intel side of the house, 7th generation Kaby Lake processors there. But more importantly, sort of the cornerstone of this machine and what it's really architected around is NVIDIA's Max-Q design technology for GeForce. So taking a high-end GPU like a GeForce GTX 1080 or a 1070 even, and squeezing it into a much thinner, lower profile, lighter machine. And if you take a look at the Zephyrus, Chris, I don't know if you can get an on-screen of that while I'm chatting through it. It is a sub 5-pound machine, and it is super thin as well. I want to say it's something like I don't know if it's like 17 millimeters. Well, it's 0.7 inches thick. And it is, again, just super thin and light, and it has a GeForce GTX 1080 in it. Now, you're probably wondering, how do you do that? And that's what this whole Max-Q design technology is all about. It is basically a combination of both clock gating on the GPU and managing the most efficient, maximum performance out of the GPU without pushing it so far that you reach a point of diminishing returns on the thermal side of it and the power consumption side of it. So just hitting that sweet spot in the clock speed curve that you get the most efficient performance out of the chip. And then also some seriously re-engineered thermal solutions in the machine itself. So Asus has this whole front area, as you can see, you take a look at the machine, this whole front area underneath the display that's in front of the keyboard that's dedicated to that cooling solution underneath there. You can see the squirrel cage fans on the bottom side. And it does push the keyboard down a little bit on unorthodox there for sure. Trackpad over on the right-hand side. Keyboard's pushed up to the very bottom edge with no palm rest. They give you a little spare rubber palm rest to go with it, just to kind of prop up a little extra space there. But what's interesting about it is, all of those design considerations, basically allow this machine to perform within like 10 to 15% of a GeForce GTX 1080. There's also when you flip the lid open, there's actually underneath the machine, it creates an air gap. It lifts up off the surface it's on just slightly to create a little air gap on each side of the machine to draw cool air in underneath. So there's some real serious mojo going on in terms of cooling. And again, within 10 to 15% of the full performance of a GeForce GTX 1080. And what's amazing, actually, what was the most amazing thing to me about it was the how silent it was. When you hear the average desktop replacement gaming notebook fire up with a big GPU on board and a heavy-duty CPU, they're usually pretty loud. This thing was actually quiet. I would say the word to describe it would be quiet, and relatively speaking, while gaming, and I think the profile is 39 dB. That's what they say it's capable of hitting. 39 decibel, noise level output max is where it's at. So impressive, better than I expected. I'll be honest with you, I had some inside baseball sort of dirt slung at me from a competitive manufacturer who will remain nameless that wasn't too big on Max-Q. They're like, this is kind of, they were kind of throwing water on it saying, they're just downclocking, it's like, mobile GeForce all over again, and why are you calling it something different? But I think when you look at the thermal solution, it's more than just a clock-gated GPU and managing that clock and power envelope. What do you guys think? Marco, what are your thoughts there?
So it's a little confusing calling it a GTX 1080 technically. Agreed. Right?
Yep.
It is the same chip. There's nuance involved. Now, I think it's cool, right? Because it's not as fast as a 1080, and maybe you can get a full-size system with the 1070 that's only a couple of percentage points behind. But to get a sub 19 millimeter machine that doesn't make a lot of noise with 1080 class performance, I understand why NVIDIA used this naming. It's GeForce GTX 1080 class performance in what's essentially something that can be considered a large ultrabook and not this giant honking desktop replacement. So I could see where guys that have big honking desktop replacements are kind of like poo-pooing it a little bit, because hey, you can get an actual 1080 for the same price and get more performance.
Right.
Well, yeah, but it's 3 times as thick and twice as heavy and louder.
Yeah,
so I think that's where the nuance comes in.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I don't think you can call it a GeForce GTX 1080. You have to call it a GeForce GTX 1080 Max-Q. It's incumbent upon the press and whoever talks about this to call that out. Make sure you're describing what that is so people understand what they're looking at and what they're dealing with. But beyond that, if you just take sort of the sum of its parts, quieter, thinner, lighter by a lot, and almost as powerful, within 10 to 15% of a full fat GeForce GTX 1080, pretty impressive, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Paulie, what do you think? This is your kind of thing, man, right?
Yeah, and I don't mind what they're doing as far as the naming scheme goes, as long as they don't go overboard with it. Because I think one of the high points of Pascal on the mobile side was they brought parity between, or near parity between, the mobile and the desktop, where before it wasn't like that. You remember, like the 980M, the desktop equivalent wasn't the 980. It was like I think the 770 or something like that.
Yeah.
So as long as they don't go overboard and create too big of a gap in performance, and I think it's fine. But that's going to be up to NVIDIA and its hardware partners to figure that one out.
Yeah.
And from what you're saying, it's not a huge gap right now. So.
Yeah, no, it's probably what I saw in terms of numbers, and what Tuan saw in terms of numbers when going through all the benchmarks in our entire gauntlet, was that it was something like 10 to 15% faster than a 1070, and maybe about as much slower than a full 1080 in a big desktop replacement machine like the next one we'll talk about, the Alienware 17. So interesting in terms of its performance. You could say, well, it's pretty much like a mobile GeForce of days gone by in terms of its performance, but actually, no, I think it's a little bit more than that. I don't think, back in the day of when NVIDIA was labeling, mobile GPUs, we didn't have, GeForce 10 class performance in gaming notebooks. We just didn't.
Well, we're starting to change the way we look at performance too, instead of just concentrating solely on numbers, which has been the case for a long time. Now it's with G-Sync and FreeSync, we're looking at, can it play games at 4K and play it smooth, and at what settings, versus can it hit triple digit frame rates or whatever we're aiming for.
Right. Yeah, no, and this machine is actually dialed in with a really nice 15.6 inch advanced hyper viewing angle IPS display, is what they call it. So really nice bright display with G-Sync. It's 120 hertz display. And when you look at the benchmarks, this machine can push high and ultra image quality settings at 1080p. It's a 1080p full HD 1080p panel. At 1080p, it can push 100 north of 100 frames per second. So couple that with G-Sync, and it's like butter. The thing is, really nice that way. Chris, is this your bag? Is this your jam? Would you like this kind of stuff?
Well, I definitely do like my portable laptops. I like the Razer Blade when I got to play with that. I love the XPS. Oh, yeah. So thin and light is definitely my style. I think it's absolutely fascinating engineering that they're getting this much out of something so crazy thin. I'm still used to seeing gaming notebooks that are 3 inches thick and weigh 20 pounds, and you're like, why is someone carrying this around? So the fact that they can even get as close as they are to a 1080 with this is pretty insane.
Right. Right. Yeah. If you want to, let's shift gears. By the way, if you want to look at something a little bit more horsepower and a little bit more oomph with the same traditional desktop replacement form factor, take a look at the Alienware 17. We've got a review up on that. The R4 revision for the machine, the 2017 model, 7th generation Core i7 quad core in there. 17.3-inch WQ HD display, 2560 by 1440. It is G-Sync. There is a G-Sync version of the panel if you want it. GeForce GTX 1080, full fat, not Max-Q, 8 gig of RAM, GDDR5X, and 16 gigs of 2400 DDR4 memory, and all that good stuff. This thing, in terms of desktop replacement machines, I'm not sure, and I can say this pretty confidently. I'm not sure of another 17-inch notebook that is as well built and high performance as the Alienware 17. It is a top shelf machine. Tuan took a look at this as well. All that Alienware lighting bling you're familiar with. They did redesign it a little bit. It's a little bit more angular now, a little bit more compact, not quite as bulky. It's a little bit thinner in spots, but it still weighs 9.75 pounds. So, to be exact. So you gotta, expect, understand what comes with the territory there. This is the full Monty for gaming notebooks. But they do a really good job. The cooling system in the back there has been re-architectured from models gone by. It does a real nice job of talk about watching the GPU and making the thermal management of the GPU. This thing doesn't even have a whiff of throttling. It's really running that 1080 full speed real well and very comfortably in that frame. So impressive stuff. Both machines, by the way, the Max-Q notebook, the Zephyrus from Asus, are premium machines. They cost a good amount of money. So $2,700, $2,699 for the Zephyrus with Max-Q, and then the Alienware 17 in its configuration that we tested, $2,950. You got a little bit more going on there, a little bit higher end config in spots. They also have a hard drive in there as well as the NVMe SSD. But good stuff. Stop by the site and check it out. Get your GeForce on, your mobile GeForce on. And here is the tiniest GeForce in all of existence. It's a USB stick. NVIDIA, I have to mention that. NVIDIA actually did a little April Fool's joke a couple of months back and teased this guy as something that can totally crank your system up just by plugging it in the USB port. Well, they actually, after the April Fool's joke was over, everybody was so impressed by the gag that they wanted one. And so NVIDIA actually made a few thousand of these things. I think it was 1,080 to be exact, if you see what they did there. 1080. So yeah, no, that's the tiniest GeForce in the web. It's cute. Yeah. Came in a cute box too, actually. NVIDIA does really good jobs in terms of packaging. I will say that. Yeah. So
and you can't buy it, unfortunately.
No, it's a 64 gig stick, but I'm afraid to plug it in. Who knows? Maybe it'll totally blow things up, or I don't know, I'll get some nasty virus, or I don't know.
Or maybe it wasn't an April Fool's prank. Maybe if you plug it in, it actually.
Yeah, man.
Like the fast load cartridge for the Commodore back in the day.
Turn my notebook into exactly. Turbo boost. All right. Well, let's shift gears and stay in the mobile. Well, no, we're not going to shift gears too much. We're going to stay in the mobile vein a little bit longer and talk about something you've been looking at lately, Paul. The Lenovo ThinkPad X1 Tablet, 2nd gen, and nimble business class convertible, 2-in-1. What do you think these days about 2-in-1s? The state of 2-in-1s. This is sort of the a poster child for the state of 2-in-1s these days, right?
Yeah, but let's not skip over the fact that while you and Tuan are playing with all these fancy gaming laptops, you send me a business-oriented one. Say, hey, get to work, Paul.
Get to work, dude.
That fact was not lost on me. Yeah, this is a 2-in-1 device, and it's most 2-in-1s are primarily aimed at consumers, and workers too, as far as productivity goes. But this one is more aimed at the SMBs, the small to medium businesses, and the enterprise. It has features that stand out versus other 2-in-1s. Let me run down the specs first. This thing is outfitted with an Intel Core i5 7Y57 processor, which is an upgrade to Kaby Lake versus the previous generation. If this was a previous generation chip, this would have been labeled as a Core M3. For this generation, they bumped it up to a Core i5. It's a low watt processor, I think 4.5 watts. It has a 12-inch Full HD display, Full HD Plus. It's 2K, I guess you call it, 2160 by 1440 IPS with touch support. Intel HD graphics, 615, 8 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM. It has a 256 gigabyte SSD M.2 with the NVMe interface, so it's pushing data through the PCIe bus. And then the rest is pretty standard fare. You have 802.11 AC, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 4.1, rear and front cameras. What makes this stand out are a few different things. For one, they put a little emphasis on rugged. They don't really bill it as like a real rugged laptop where you take it out in the field and bang it around. But it does meet some military certifications for, like dust and wind and that sort of thing. The chassis is made out of a magnesium hybrid material that they say is polycarbonate glass fiber, which is, kind of above what I learned in school. But the takeaway there is that it's both light and sturdy. As far as where it's applicable to the enterprise, it has certain security features like a TPM security chip. It's Intel vPro certified, so it's going to work with the programs that the professionals use. As far as what's different versus the previous generation, it's they didn't change it up too much. The design is almost exactly the same, except that they added a magnet to the case so it stays shut easier. I don't know if that was really a problem with the first gen. I don't remember it being one. Other than that, it's the same. It has the familiar Lenovo keyboard with the track point nub. It comes with the stylus with a couple of different ways that you can store it. There's a little cloth loop that comes out that you can hold it in. They also include a little thing that you can stick in a USB port and hold the stylus there that way. As far as performance goes, you're working with the dual-core processor. That's the base clock is 1.2 gigahertz. It can ramp up to 3.3 gigahertz. So it didn't really tear up the benchmarks, but what it did do is show that it was a little bit faster than the previous generation, which is what you want when you're bumping up to a new model. But there are faster 2-in-1s out there. However, you're going to miss out on the business features if that's what you're after and that's what you need. And then the other thing that sets this apart is it supports a couple of add-on modules that Lenovo offers. One of them is called the Presenter module, and that is basically a built-in Pico projector that can beam a 60-inch image. So, if you're in the boardroom and you're putting on a presentation, you can slap that sucker on and beam it on the wall, turn the lights down, beam it on the wall, and there you go. There's also a productivity module that is essentially another battery. It's a 24 watt-hour battery that Lenovo says will give you an additional 5 hours of battery life. It also adds a USB 3.0 Type A port, HDMI output, and it has a special port for connecting Lenovo's OneLink Plus dock. So that is the ThinkPad X1 tablet in a nutshell.
My goodness.
Second gen.
Tons of features there. So this is a Core i5 7Y57 processor that's on board. That is a 4.5 watt, what we used to know as the Core M series. Yep. Intel is labeling a Core i now. The 7Y57 is a 4.5 watt versus 15 watt chip for a full Core i5. So we want to make that distinction. But what's interesting about 7th gen 4.5 watt Kaby Lake, if you will, is that it's a little bit more robust in terms of it hits slightly higher clock speeds. It has a little bit better implementation of speed step, I believe, right? Or speed shift, excuse me. And so it ramps up quicker, has a little bit higher clock speed. It's a little bit more performant than the previous gen Core M series, right? How did you see it on the CPU side in the benchmark?
Yeah, it is a little bit more, but it's nothing crazy. I mean, still, I think if you can find a deal in a previous generation, that would be compelling if you can save a few $100s. But if you want the latest and you want that little bump in performance and you want, to be the most current, then, this is it.
Yeah, I think, in comparison from what we've seen in testing on various devices, not just this device, Core I in the 4.5 watt for Kaby Lake 7th gen, it performs, if you looked at the previous gen, like lower end Core I, so like in the case of the 7Y5070, if you looked at the Core i5, I think 6200U previous gen, so not Kaby Lake, but Skylake, it actually performs about on par with that. It's not as fast as a Kaby Lake, full fat Kaby Lake 15-watt chip now, but it's within sniffing distance of the previous gen full Core i5 15-watt chip in most benchmarks from what we've seen. So it's interesting for sure. Yeah, well-built machine for sure from Lenovo. Full HD display, actually Full HD Plus, so 2160 by 1440. How did that map out on a 12-inch display? Is that a little tight, or is it? How's the display? Is it good?
No, I thought it fit fairly well, as opposed to going with like 3K or even 4K. And of course, you can manipulate the icons to fit how you need it. But I thought it was a good fit for the screen size.
Is this your kind of machine, Marco? I know you like the ultralights for sure.
I think it is a really nice, as far as convertibles go. Lenovo did a good job, in terms of, again, not ruggedizing it, but making it more durable. It has good looks. It has a nice Lenovo keyboard, the stylus, good screen. So it hits all the right bullet points. Personally, as I've mentioned on previous shows, I prefer a clamshell. I like something I can use on my lap easily. Yeah. But if I was to consider a 2-in-1, it's definitely worth a look.
Yeah. No, what blows me away about certainly with Skylake, the platform architecture these days, and being able to get NVMe into a device of this size, and getting over 2 gigs a second for reads and 1.5 or 1.4 gigs a second for writes out of the storage subsystem in a device like this. It's like, man, you're taking the responsiveness of that system up a whole nother level for something that's basically it's a tablet. It's impressive stuff these days,
Absolutely.
Yeah, so good to see that in there as well. But yeah, Lenovo does some good stuff. I'm actually looking forward to a machine that we're hoping to get our hands on real soon. The Yoga X1 Carbon. Excuse me, the X1 Yoga. Lenovo ThinkPad X1 Yoga. That's the one. And they've got a new version of it, a new revision, smaller now with an OLED display that is sort of like what they did with the X1 Carbon, where they trimmed it down, trimmed the bezels down. So could be really nice. Always looking forward to Lenovo's machines. I like them. They tend to be what I use for a daily driver lately, just because they're just workhorses. Good stuff. Yep. So Marco, you have been toying around with some stuff that we really haven't delved into much before. You've been playing with Raspberry Pis and doing some retro computing on them, huh?
I have. So, as I've mentioned many times in the past, kind of got started in technology with the Commodore 64, and over the years ended up falling in love with Commodore and loving the Amiga and getting all wrapped up in the, Amiga versus Apple IIgs versus Atari ST kind of battles years ago. But the Amiga holds a special place in my heart, and I still follow the Amiga online constantly. I spend half of my time on Facebook in the Amiga users group. You'd be surprised how much activity still goes on in there. So someone created these. Let me see if I can hold it in the right spot. Someone 3D printed some mini retro Amiga cases. So it's tiny that can hold a Raspberry Pi 3. Hopefully I'm holding that in there. So here's the Raspberry Pi. It's just a small plastic enclosure that looks like an old Amiga. And there are a few ways that you can emulate the Amiga nowadays on a Raspberry Pi. One of the software packages I follow is called Amibian, and version 1.4 had just come out, and I had asked my wife for one of these cases for my birthday, and I happened to have the case and the Raspberry Pi in hand. I said, all right, let's do an article on building a retro Amiga, and then let me kind of throw the hot hardware twist on it and do some stupid stuff with the Pi, like overclock it, and I also modified the case just for giggles, just to see what it would do. So here's what my Raspberry Pi motherboard looks like at the moment. Let me see if can you guys see the custom active cooler I put on there? Isn't that kind of sick?
Oh, nice.
So active cooler on there, and then
that is beautiful.
Threw a heatsink on the memory chip also, and had to cut the bottom of my case to accommodate that. Let me see if I can get it in here while I'm chatting with you fellas. So yeah, I had to cut a hole in the bottom so that heatsink kind of sticks out, and raised up the bottom so there'd be some airflow. Now, what I should say is there's absolutely no point in overclocking a Raspberry Pi if you're going to emulate an Amiga on it, right? So the originals had a 7 megahertz 68K processor in it, only 7, and this thing, and a Raspberry Pi by default, is a 1.2 gigahertz ARM processor here, many times more powerful. So when you're emulating an old Amiga and you choose, 7 megahertz 6800K in the setup, it runs exactly like a 7 megahertz 6800K processor. But if you're stupid like me and you want to avoid your warranty, there is a simple text file that you can edit that will tell the Raspberry Pi, run at these clocks, these voltages, do this to the memory, do this to the GPU. So actively cooled it, overclocked everything, and on my peak overclock, I ended up taking it up to 1.5 gigahertz with 600 megahertz memory with tweaked memory timings, and I ended up building an emulated Amiga that was about 9 times faster than the fastest Amiga 4000 based on the 68040, and about 300 times faster than the Amiga 600, which was the lowest end Amiga that ever shipped. And it's just super fun. And what's great about a setup like this, it's super cheap, under $100 if you don't want the 3D printed case. You don't have to just use it for one system. You can throw RetroPie on there and have a bunch of platforms emulated. But if you do something crazy like this where it's focused on one platform, the Amiga used to run apps from 880K floppies. So you throw a 32 gig SD card in here, you're kind of flirting with some legal issues here, but it's abandonware that nobody supports anymore. But you can technically have the entire software library of the Amiga on a little card like that. So it's just a fun way to sort of relive my youth, kind of re-experience Amiga OS, poke around, play some of the old games for not a lot of money. And it's just really cool, fun stuff. I really dig this little system. So it runs off, the Pi runs off USB power, basically.
Sure, yeah.
So I literally have it powered off of the USB hub in my monitor with a HDMI cable plugged in. And I can just hit a button, switch inputs, and I can play an Amiga game if I want in 2 seconds. It's really cool.
That's neat.
That is. It's amazing what they're doing with the Raspberry Pi these days and all these single board computers. I mean, there's a couple of other more powerful single board computers you could probably work with that setup you're doing with the Amiga. But very cool stuff. And it is amazing to think, what you can fit on, I don't know, however big the Raspberry Pi is, a couple of 3 inches square.
Yep.
What did you say, like 300 times more powerful than the Amiga?
than the slowest Amiga, yeah. Now, again, though, there's nothing that will really use that, right? It was strictly to run this old benchmark just to see how long the bar was going to be.
Yeah.
But it's fun, it's cool. It's the same reason we overclock now and screw around to see how long we can get that bar in the bar chart, Yeah. It's definitely cool stuff. Now, you mentioned there's other platforms you can do it on. You don't need new hardware. You can run something called WinUAE. It's a Windows accelerator, a Windows emulator for the Amiga. And that's way faster than this, even on a low-end PC, right? So,
yeah.
If you had an old laptop laying around, none of the old Amiga stuff will use a GPU either. So even if you got an old notebook, as long as it works and the CPU has a decent horsepower, you can emulate an old Amiga very easily on an old machine like that.
Paulie, what was the first computer you ever geeked out on?
The Commodore 64. I think same as Marco.
Wow.
That was my first one.
Funny you mentioned the Commodore 64. funny you mentioned that, because Dave and I were talking about how popular this article was, and the fellow that makes this case makes an even smaller one that will hold a Raspberry Pi Zero. It's a Commodore 64 case that holds a Pi Zero, so I might have to experiment with that at some point.
Yeah, definitely, that would be rad.
It's really cool.
Excellent, good stuff. Yeah, honestly, I started a little bit, well, definitely late compared to you guys. My first machine I actually built myself was a 46 DX33, so I was way late. I mean, I had we had Atari and stuff like that, but I wasn't into the computing side of it. I played games, that was about it. But
yeah. So I never had, back in the day, I went from a Commodore 64 right to an HP PC. So okay. I never bought an Amiga, even though I wanted one. I was selling them. In high school, I worked at Software, etc. And at one point, I was actually the top Amiga salesman in the country. Yay, at least for that chain. But I always loved it. And then later on, I got one. Years ago, I posted a retro collection on HotHardware. I think the article might be dead at this point. But I still have my old Amigas in storage. Now, all these old machines had, not all of them, but many of them had batteries on the motherboards, these Varta batteries that leak. And if you don't clean that up, it literally eats the board. And lots of them lots of the time I spend on Facebook is looking at people repair these old boards. I'm fascinated by how good these guys are fixing the traces and fixing the boards from the acid damage. But yeah, if you have old systems in storage and that battery leaked, odds are the systems are dead. And if you don't want to spend money on these old big pieces of hardware, $44 for a Pi, you could technically, if you have a keyboard and mouse laying around and you don't care about the case and you have a micro SD card laying around, $44 for a Raspberry Pi kit, you could do this. That's cool stuff.
It's amazing the ecosystem that exists currently for the Raspberry Pi, and I think that's what makes that little single board computer stand out amongst all the rest, even the competitors that show up on the market, right? It's just the unbelievable ecosystem and support behind it, and people just writing stuff for it and targeting to it. So when you built this, what's the degree of difficulty? Can the average fairly computer savvy person pull this off, or is it you really got to geek out, dig in, and learn some stuff?
No, the average person can do it. The hardest part. So the setup is super easy. You download this software release. It downloads as an image file. You use a free program to just write that image file to the SD card, plug it into the Pi, and it boots. Like, that's it as far as the initial setup. Mm-hmm. Then there's two things that make it a little bit difficult, because you have to work around some old software. First, you have to log in and then free up the rest of the free space on your SD card so that you can use it for other apps. Mm-hmm. That just requires poking around a command line. It's a couple of lines. I explained that in the article. The harder part now, once you have that done, you have to get Amiga files from another location onto here. Now, the easiest way to do it is to just copy them from a PC to a flash drive, and then put the flash drive in here, and then transfer it to the micro SD card. You can't just take the micro SD card out and plug it in your PC and transfer the files, because it's the Amiga file system, and the PC won't read it. But if you go from the USB card back onto here, you have to use a program called Midnight Commander, which basically it's two columns, all text, no mouse input. You have to use your keyboard to navigate through the directories, highlight what you want to copy, then copy it over to the micro SD card, and then you can access it from within the Amiga. That's the basic setup. Once you do it once, you're done. It's very easy, but that's going to take some tinkering if you've never worked at the command prompt and aren't comfortable with the keyboard. And if you want to go a step further, there's something called WHD load, where you can run all these old games from a virtualized hard drive. I haven't taken that step yet, but then you can literally just have everything inside Workbench and click on it and run it, instead of having to. The way the Amiga used to work is most games booted from a floppy. So you launch the emulator, you virtually insert a floppy, you virtually restart the emulator, and it boots from that floppy. Whereas with WHD load, you can just kind of click through the games and launch them that way.
Midnight Commander, such an 80s name, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Love it, man. Yeah, reliving the days. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Chris, let's make Chris feel young. Chris, what was your first computer?
Hang on, had to unmute myself. It was some 133 megahertz PC. Nothing too old, but
Yeah. Nothing classic, Chris.
I don't know if it was quite a Pentium 3, but
Wow. Yeah, no, I came in back when there were discrete math coprocessors being dropped into the machines. It was before the DX, right? I think was the first one with the integrated math coprocessor. So yeah, I'm not that vintage, but yeah, if you remember the days of Amiga and all that good stuff, you can do it today on the Pi and relive it. Good stuff. Stop by Hot Hardware and check that out. Marco, are we going to be giving away some toys in the coming weeks, you think? We've been meaning to put that up.
I think so. I think you and I need to chat because I believe the hardware is in someone else's hand at the moment, and we have to figure out what's happening with it afterwards. Oh no! So you still have that set up?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Okay, so I know we keep saying it, but we're this close to announcing a giveaway of some very cool. I'll say it's AMD gear. How's that?
Yes. Yeah, it's a Ryzen setup, and we just need to figure out whether or not we're going to build it or send out a kit that can be built. How's that?
Yeah.
That's not too much commitment, right?
No, that's perfect.
So yeah, stop by hothardware.com. Check us out. Come check out all the stories. We'll leave them in the link list below here. Sorry for a couple of glitches in the live stream. We will get this down honest. And you can find us around the web, Hot Hardware, on Facebook, twitter.com/HotHardware, youtube.com/HotHardware, where you're probably watching us now, hopefully. And Google Plus, we're all over the place. Paul, Chris, you have any words of wisdom before we sign off and go into the ether?
Have at it, Chris.
I don't know, just kind of cursing my ISP right now, really, but
yeah. So yes, was it Comcast? No.
It is not Comcast. They are not up in the great Maine woods.
The woods of Maine, where the men are men and the ISPs aren't holding up today. Damn it! Well, that's all right. We will prevail, and I think we did. Hopefully, YouTube is good and keeps the stream alive in one contiguous VOD, and you can catch the video on demand afterwards, after the show.
Yes.
After the stream. So yes, thanks again, everybody, and have a pleasant week. We'll try and catch you again soon, and take care.
Cool.
Hit the stop.